This is Jim Bish with the Americans in Wartime Museum. Today's date is February 12th, 2019, and I'm conducting an interview with Greg Houk in Sun City West, Arizona. Greg, would you please give me your full name and where you were born?
My name is Gregory Earl Houk. I was born in Waukesha, Wisconsin.
Okay. And did you grow up in Wisconsin?
Just for 5 years, and then it was off to Modesto, California, and returning to the Racine area of Wisconsin, and then on to, as a junior in high school, on to Aurora, Illinois.
Okay. And so it was in Aurora, Illinois that you graduated from high school?
That's correct.
And what year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated in 1966.
Okay. The Vietnam War, or the Tonkin Gulf incident and all that was in August of '64. So we really started landing troops in early spring of '65. So you were right at the beginning of the Vietnam engagement as far as increasing numbers in Vietnam.
The base I was on had about 25,000 GIs.
Well, did you? How did you find your way into the military from high school after you graduated?
I enlisted, following in my dad's footsteps. He served in World War II in the U.S. Navy as a Morse code operator.
Okay. And so you enlisted shortly after graduation from high school, or was there a little gap there?
November 6th.
Of '66.
Yeah, of '66.
And obviously, the war was in the news almost daily at that point.
Correct.
So where did you go to for your basic training?
I started out at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, for basic training, and then I made quite a few stops before I ended up in Vietnam.
Were you, how long were you in Kentucky? 8 weeks? Go through
8
basics,
weeks.
8 weeks?
And then I was selected to go to advanced infantry training in Fort Ord, California, of which I was slated to go to officer candidate school, but I was injured in an artillery accident, and that took away my hearing, which took direct combat out of play.
So you never went to officer candidate school then as a result of that?
I did not. They put me back in the pool, and I ended up going to Fort Rucker, Alabama, and from there to Keesler Air Force Base, Mississippi. From there back to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. From Fort Leonard Wood to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis, and then I was supposed to go directly to Vietnam from there. While home on leave, or at some point, I got infectious hepatitis, so I ended up in the hospital in Great Lakes Naval Hospital for 7 weeks while I was in home on leave, and then I had another extended leave of a month to help recover after I was released.
So all of this, what was your MOS, and what were you doing at all these stops?
Basically, it was changing MOSs. That's what all the changes were, and a lot of it was relative to my injury at Fort Ord, which was caused by artillery training. And then I ended up in as a personnel specialist, which at the battalion level, which I worked in a battalion that was about 1,200 men. So
Was that where were you at?
That was at
point?
Long Binh in Vietnam.
Okay. And so when you left the Great Lakes Naval Hospital, and then you had some recuperation time, where did you come back into active service then?
That's
after-
when directly to Vietnam.
So they took you directly back right to
Right
Vietnam
from there,
from that
right,
point.
yeah.
And what was your MOS at that point?
Personnel specialist.
Okay. And how were you, you received orders then while you were at home? As far as
I had the
report?
orders originally. They were just retyped and redated, and,
Okay.
yeah.
Just waiting on you to get
So
help
I
in.
got, once I was healed and better, my mom took me to O'Hare. O'Hare, I was on to LAX, I think, if I remember right. And then from there, I met up with a group of guys that were going, and was Osaka, Japan, and
Mhm.
I think we landed in Alaska and then Osaka, Japan, and
Yeah.
then right to Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Vietnam.
Did, when was that? When did you land? Do you remember the month?
It was
Year?
November of, I think it was like the 9th of November, something like that, in 68. No, that can't be right. It had to be 67. Yes, it was in 1967.
Okay. So you landed in Vietnam in 1967, and where were you stationed at in Vietnam after you landed?
Landing at Tan Son Nhut, we had about a 15-mile ride to the 90th Replacement Company, which was located at the Long Binh complex.
Okay. And what job did they have you doing? Were you still in personnel?
I
as far as
was
remotes?
a personnel specialist, and I was responsible for one of the line companies, which equated to about probably about 300 men. And then there was another company that was attached to our unit that I was responsible for as well, and it was only maybe 150, 200 men.
Yeah. What was, as a personnel specialist, what are some things that your job entailed as far as just making sure that the company strength were there, or what are some
Correct,
things you did?
that the strength was maintained, that we had the proper, that people were being slotted in positions that they had been trained for. Because of the way the war was structured, people served 1 year and they were on their way back home. So there was a constant troop movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked. They had it figured out, and it worked.
Yeah. So your job then was to match and make sure you had people coming in that matched those that were outgoing.
Yeah.
Now, you arrived in November of 1967.
Correct.
Tet Offensive starts just 2 months later.
Correct. February 1st, I believe it was.
Yeah. How did that all impact you? Your early part
Well,
of
initially,
Vietnam?
when I got to Vietnam, it was the war really hadn't ramped up. There was, of course, there was always, most of the fighting was done at night. Mm-hmm. So there were always outgoing artillery shells, some incoming rockets and mortars, and it gets pretty scary. But once Tet Offensive hit, it was a whole different ballgame. It just got pretty ugly real fast.
Yeah. What changes did you immediately see, and how did that impact what you were doing over there?
Well, we had pretty free run of the country, and in fact, I was about 25 miles from Saigon and had the ability, as our unit needed different supplies, things had to be accomplished, that I could get down to Saigon weekly or maybe a couple times a week. But once Tet Offensive hit, nobody went anywhere. Mm-hmm. You weren't allowed off base, and you did what you needed to accomplish right there, and it tightened up a lot.
Mm-hmm. Were there close by incoming as far as where you were at?
Well, February 1st was the beginning of the Tet Offensive, and it got ugly real fast. I was probably, as best I can remember, maybe a quarter mile, maybe a little bit more away from a huge ammunition dump at Long Binh. Well, the ammunition dump was in back of the incoming troop area. So they had a place where they could bring in 600 new people. And that night, the Viet Cong marched right through that new people area, killed 30 plus, and blew up the ammo dump. Now, keep in mind, I'm only a quarter mile away. What I saw, I thought it was an atom bomb because I had never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
That mushroom cloud went up and it stayed up there for 13 hours.
Yeah.
And the hole that it made in the ground, and the shrapnel is, you know, even being that distance away, it was landing everywhere all around us. So it was pretty scary. And then, of course, then we were all called to the perimeter because we had no idea where the attacks were going to be.
Yeah.
So, and my unit was right on the perimeter. So.
Sounds like, yeah. So how did, not only were you there on the perimeter, but how did it impact, did all incoming personnel changes and outgoing personnel, I'm sure they were all shut down during that time period.
But everything was shut down for about 3 to 5 days. Yeah, until the higher ups figured what was happening and at what point did they get control back, because they did.
Yeah.
And it didn't take long.
Yeah. How did the, do you remember hospitals or anything, the mobile units?
We had three evacuation hospitals on our base, medevac, they were all medevac hospitals, but they were far enough away from me that I really didn't, you know, out of sight, out of mind. You don't have the option to or opportunity to see what goes on in their world. But helicopters were a huge part of the war, and to see a helicopter in the air, very seldom you ever see one. Yeah. You know, there'd be 20 to 30 in a row, and so, and you knew that was not a good day for somebody when they were all leaving.
Yeah. In that early time frame, you said it was, how long was it before American forces got control of that area?
Our area? Immediate. Probably, you know, I think there was a lot of tension because you didn't know what the potential was for the second wave. Well, there was no second wave.
Yeah.
But I think the battles that ensued put the people of the country on notice that we were taking back control quickly, and we did in the area where I was.
Yeah.
The thing that's on the internet that if anybody's interested is the Battle of Long Binh, which was formulated between a triangle from Long Binh to Tan Son Nhut to Bien Hoa, which made this triangle. And unfortunately for the enemy, we killed almost 500 guys that night. And then they laid out there for about 3 days before anybody made any attempt to bury any of them. And then the graves were mass graves.
Right.
So my unit was because we were in a construction unit, we had the equipment to dig these mass graves.
What unit were you attached to?
I was in the 62nd Combat Engineer Battalion, and that was a construction battalion. So we were, initially when they went to Vietnam, they were building airports. They had the ability and mobility to they built an airport, I think in less than 3 days, and they were landing jets and big planes on it.
So as a personnel specialist, you were filling positions beyond your battalion though, or was it just within your battalion?
Pretty much in our battalion, yeah, right.
And so within a week, other than guarding the perimeter and making sure no other attacks occurred, did things get back to normal within another 2 or 3 weeks, or was it?
Yeah, it was probably even shorter than that. Once, see, on our perimeter, we didn't take any hit other than sporadic mortars. My guess is they were trying to keep troops spread out about the base rather than having them pool where the bigger and larger attacks came to.
Yeah.
So.
Did you have any forewarning? Did anybody talk about a buildup or anything in the area that the possibility?
That never came down to our level at all.
Yeah.
My guess, the way the NCOs and the officers reacted, that they were in complete surprise. Mm-hmm. You know, whether they had been told anything at the higher levels, who knows?
Yeah.
But the trickle down, there was nothing.
Yeah. You said that fairly quickly things got back to normal, a little bit of normalcy anyway, where you were at. Did that mean that your job, when you were replacing personnel, were they then outgoing people that had reached their year? Were they starting to go back out and bringing in
that pretty much shut down for probably 10 or 11, maybe 12 days. And where the troops kept coming in, but nobody left. Because the places where they were leaving from, Benoit and Tonsanut, had to reorganize. Some of those bases, air bases, had been rocketed and mortared so that they had to make repairs to the runways, etc. Tonsanut was pretty ugly. You think, well, in the Air Force in the rear with the gear, not that night.
Yeah.
They were right on the front line, and they were spread way too thin.
Yeah.
That they had a lot of major problems there.
What news did you hear while things were going on those first couple weeks of TET? Beyond where you were, did you get much news as far as what was going on in the rest of the stuff, you know?
The only access we had to news was the Armed Forces radio station out of Saigon, and I think in retrospect you're fed what they want you to hear, and that's all we knew.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like you had access to NBC or ABC.
Variety of sources,
right? Yeah, we had no sources.
So. And what were they telling you? What was the Armed Forces Network telling you?
Everything was going well. All the attacks had been stopped in hand, and that we had taken control of the war again. And I think that was pretty much true.
Yeah. Little pockets were resistant. That was a little bit, but
right.
For the most part.
But the initial, that February 1st was huge. And that, of course, it changed the way the war was to end.
Yeah. Did that, you said that it took a while before outgoing started leaving Vietnam.
Yeah.
Was that was roughly 2 weeks or longer before?
Yeah, probably about 10 days or something.
Before you got back to some normalcy as far as people that had ended their year were able to get out of there.
Right.
Did they increase the number of those coming into your battalion, or was it kept maintained at a pretty steady level?
Flow. Nothing changed.
Yeah.
And then I left Vietnam in November of 68.
Yeah. So you were, after that initial surge of the TET, things kind of balanced out through the remainder of your time there, and you got back to normalcy as far as personnel leaving and personnel coming in.
Yeah.
How many personnel specialists were within the battalion?
As best I remember, I think there were 6, but 4 handled the line companies, of which I was one. And then we had a number of other office personnel that had different other jobs.
Did you all coordinate together when you were filling up the line and the personnel needs, or did you have your own specific parts within the battalion that you worked with?
Yeah, pretty much parts. Everything was separated.
Okay.
But the common part was that we were all in the same building.
Yeah.
When I got there, we were in tents. The old heavy-duty Army tents, small, and that was both for sleeping and for working. And then by the time I left, the personnel had an office, and it was a regular office, although it was a metal, it wasn't a pole building, but kind of it was. And then we had huts that we could sleep in that were concrete floors, wood frames, and metal walls.
Yeah. So what were some of the different MOSs, or were there many different MOSs within your battalion that you were looking for as far as the different types of positions that you were needing?
Well, most everybody we got was trained as an engineer. Most of them came from Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, but every once in a while they'd throw some infantry people at us, and then it was on-the-job training for them. But
they wanted a few people with strong infantry backgrounds.
well, not so much that, they just
didn't have enough.
they had filled their other slots and they needed to push these people someplace, so they pushed them at us. But that wasn't unlike any of the other units. They had the same issues.
Yeah. Were they fairly easily brought up to speed as far as what they needed to be doing?
Yeah. On the job training, you're not left to fend for yourself. You usually got 3, 4, or maybe even more people teaching you what you need to know.
Yeah. Yeah. And as an engineer, what were many of them doing?
They were in the field, bridges, helipads, and they had a lot of mobility in that a lot of this heavy equipment could be helicoptered to any place.
So they would break down equipment and get them to helicopters?
Well, the large helicopters, they just pick it up and fly it to wherever they need it.
Heavy enough the weight didn't bother them too bad?
No, it didn't slow them down at all.
Wow.
And roads.
Yeah.
We were building major roads. Not like the interstates here, but certainly like equal to or better than community service roads.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's what you were doing from November 67 through November 68.
Yeah,
Were you counting down, when we talked to you just a little bit about the year, the year rotations of servicemen over there, was there a lot of counting down that last 2 or 3 months of your year coming in?
Yeah, most guys had what they called short time calendars. And when you got to 100 days, you started your calendar. And basically it was made up into square, boxes, whatever, and each box had a number in it, and then as you completed that day, you X'd out that number.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think that went versus before and after, where we usually send a battalion or a company in and then we pull out the entire company or battalion? Or
I thought it worked well for the Army because you were pretty much on task the entire time. You didn't have 1,200 guys trying to learn what to do at the same time, because that would have been disastrous.
You were able to keep up with training more efficiently.
Yeah.
A lot of the people that condemn that say that cohesiveness broke down because you're always interjecting new parts into the system, and that wasn't as cohesive as it is otherwise. Any thoughts on that, the cohesiveness? Did you see any of that?
I thought the new people were taken in hand and given everything that they needed to have. I thought it worked perfectly. I can't imagine it with a transition of people rotating out a year from the date that they arrived, that I thought it worked great. I thought it worked well for the Army, and I thought it was great for the people as they came in.
Yeah.
And
one of the benefits they always talked about was morale was kept a little bit better because you knew when you were
Right,
coming out of there
Yeah.
and that type of thing, and you
Right.
knew kind of the time frame that you would be there,
right.
which was different. So that worked. How about yourself? Did you keep any short-term calendar?
I did, yeah, just like everybody else, and
What was it?
mostly nude women, yeah, typing, piece of typing paper with, yeah, just,
Numbers on them?
right, and then
Yeah.
you cross them off.
Yeah. What was your process when you left? Was it just you get on a helicopter and took you to a main base, then you were out of there? Or what do you
No.
remember about leaving Vietnam?
When I left, because I was in headquarters company and had the ability to do different things, had friends that had access to Jeeps and et cetera. It was myself and three of my friends rotated out on the same day.
Uh-huh.
So we had a couple of my friends drove me and the other the three of us to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, where we then began the out-country processing, which didn't take very long because we had all our orders and everything, and
It was pretty cut and dry.
and we were on a plane in probably less than 2 hours.
Did you know that you said there were three of your friends? Did you know you were all getting out on the same date? Had
Well,
that
I
been-
did because I was in personnel.
Okay.
They may not have been aware of it initially, but of course, as we got closer,
Yeah.
our orders, my name came down with their names on the same,
Okay, so
orders.
you were all identified together
Sure.
on that certain date. Okay. And when you left Vietnam then, where did you go? Was it the same journey back through Japan and?
As best I remember, I think it was. I don't think we flew direct. And then we landed at an Air Force base in California, and I don't remember the name of that. And then I flew on to Chicago, where you're in the service, you're supposed to get 30 days leave when you left the war zone.
Before we totally leave Vietnam, was there any stories or anything that you saw or did, funny, hilarious, very frightful, that you can remember that was something you might want to include?
Yeah, Tet Offensive was very frightful. I had made a trip down to Bearcat to see a friend of mine who I was in training with in Indianapolis, and I'm driving the Jeep across this rice paddies, and midday, and out of nowhere comes rifle fire. Well, the only target out there was me.
Yeah.
And so that that brings real life back into play real quick. So, but I did get there and get back without any problems.
Did you take a number of those trips like that, those short term?
Just that one.
Just that
That
one.
was enough.
That was enough.
Yeah.
So we're back in California. You're now back home in Illinois for 30 days? Is that
Well, that's what was supposed to happen, but what actually happened is that the guys that are at the lower end of the Army really have a lot to say with what happens. So being in personnel, I was coming back in November of 1968. Well, Chicago, it was pretty ugly. They were getting, there was snow on the ground when I came back. And I knew it was going to be the dead of winter, so I didn't want to take my leave in the dead of the winter. Who wants 30 days when you can't do anything?
Yeah.
So what I did, I gave myself some time, extra time in transit, so I had a couple weeks at home, and then showed up on the date that I was supposed to be there, so that I could then go back and get my leave time the following summer by saying I never got any leave when I came back. Well, of course, when they went back to check the records, I didn't. So, but all I needed was a couple weeks in the summer. And
Yeah.
I got that without any problem,
So you were back in Chicago. When did you leave Chicago then, actually?
I
Was it like
got
around-
out of the service in November 6th of 69.
So between November of 68 and November of 69, what were you doing?
I was administering mental aptitude tests
This is in Chicago?
in Chicago at a,
Recruitment
what they
center?
called an AFES stations, Armed Forces Entrance and Examination Station. And we were processing again about 1,200 men a day. Some were going to active duty, some were sent in by their draft boards for processing, and they were sent home.
These are both draftees and enlisted,
And both, right.
and they were in there signing up or getting their test taken? And all
They
that?
weren't signing up there.
They'd already signed up, they already,
right,
okay.
yeah. And it was the job wasn't difficult. You just tried to be a nice guy, and because these guys are scared to death. And some of them were going in that day, and those who were drafted, it was right there that they were designated Army or Marine. They'd have them count off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the even numbers were Army, and the odd numbers were Marines, and that was tough to watch. I knew, having been over in Vietnam, that the Marines were in every crap hole there was, and those guys were in for a tough time.
Yeah. Navy wasn't, no Navy personnel? They
Well,
didn't
we
let
had
you out of
Navy and Air Force, but they were
Smaller numbers?
smaller numbers, and they had already been designated exactly where they were going.
Okay.
So
Did the testing have any impact on where they ended up, whether they were Army or Marine?
none.
None? Just the
whatsoever.
numbering,
Yeah.
just how you came through the door?
Yep. That's it. Where you picked to stand in line. So
I've heard stories about, they just happened to be different. People were in the wrong place at the wrong time as far as where they wanted to go versus where they ended
Right.
up, just
Right.
by happenstance.
so
So is that what happened to you too, when you went through initially?
no, I was enlisted. So I was designated basic training, and then my next location was already in line.
So you were basically did a lot of testing during that time period of personnel. How long, like hour testing and then?
But basically it was, they were in the room for close to an hour. The actual test probably was 45 minutes, but by the time it was me and 100 guys, 100 people in the room, and it was up to me to get everybody done in an hour. And then by the end of their day, all their scoring of their aptitude tests everything had been scored and was in each individual's folders
By the end of the day?
by the end of that day.
And that process followed it, day after day after day?
5 days a week, right?
Testing in the morning, and then?
It was actually a great job for me. I had to be at work at, I think it was 5:30. And the mental aptitude part was the first part of the day. So everybody coming into the door, we got them first.
Right away.
So at probably about 11:15, 11:30 every day, we were done. So for me, it was go down to the USO, get some tickets to the Cubs game, which were free, and then ride up on the L to see the Cubs play. So I ended up like seeing, I don't know, probably over 30 games that year.
Yeah. So you were, so in doing this, did you have to score them, or were they scored by a machine?
They were
Like scan
scored
sheet?
by a machine. Some we had to hand score because maybe they weren't penciled out correctly or whatever, but not very many of them.
Yeah. And then that, along with what branch of the service they were going into, and identified who was going into what jobs
Sure,
probably from that. And you did that most of the year that you were in Chicago
The
after
entire
returning?
year, yeah.
And you lived downtown Chicago? Or
I
where-
lived up on Winthrop Drive, which was maybe 2.5, 3 miles, with 4 other guys that were in the same building I was.
Yeah.
We didn't do the same thing. In fact, none of the others did what I did, but
Were you, were you able to go home once in a while to Aurora? Or in that
oh
area
yeah,
too?
sure, yeah, because the weekends were free, afternoons were free. And most, I think everybody had, maybe one guy did not have a car, but I did, I had a car.
So you were pretty lucky to be stationed that close to where your
Yeah.
family's home was.
Right.
Because a lot of people weren't. A lot of people were stationed a
No,
long ways
I
away.
was very fortunate, yeah.
And you knew that you were going to be out in November of 1969.
Yeah.
Before, when you left Vietnam, did you have a chance to re-up and go back to
Yeah,
Vietnam?
that was never a consideration. I had seen everything I needed to see. You know, you start, just that, the Tet Offensive, and you start seeing all those dead bodies, and
Yeah,
you don't need any more of that.
yeah. So you did your year in 1969 in Chicago. What was your process about when you ended up leaving or getting out of the service?
Oh, that was pretty easy.
You knew when your end date was going
Yeah,
when you started there?
all the out processing was done not at the building where I was, but it was done at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, which was probably 25 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
So I was, technically that was my duty station, but the reality of it was the job was downtown Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that happened coming back from Vietnam and coming to Chicago was I came back right after the Democratic Convention.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there were 16,000 troops in Chicago. So it was like going from one war zone right into another. And coming to work, we were not allowed to wear our uniforms outside of work.
So you changed clothes when you got to the building?
Yeah, we had a change right there. Because that just opened the door to being hassled by the
Right.
protesters, et cetera. And we had the sheriff, I don't know if it was county sheriff or Chicago police, maybe both, outside our building, maintaining order.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much because all of us who worked there looked just like the people that were being processed, we never got hassled. You know, people never knew from one day to the next that you were the same guy that came in the day before.
Right.
So
So it wasn't your hair, things like that, didn't give anybody a clue?
no, because
No,
by that
people
time
shorter hair, yeah.
we had short hair, but not that short. You know, wasn't like we
They were a
had
little
our-
more lax with the rules.
Oh, yeah.
and then-
Yeah. Actually, it was, that last year was not like being in the service at all. You went
Just
to
like-
work, you did your job, you left.
Just like being in a job.
Yeah, you didn't have to report to anybody. It's just do your job, don't cause any trouble,
Yeah,
and everybody's happy. And they
Yeah.
were.
yeah. Well, that's good. So your commanding officers were really at Fort Sheridan, and if you did have to report or something did happen?
There was a commanding officer on site, but he was, I don't know what, he was day-to-day operations in charge of that. And I think, my guess is it was pretty much a hassle-free job for him. Because I don't know that there were any personnel problems while I was there.
I'm certain they probably picked a certain number of people that they knew were pretty safeguard as far as being personnel issues that got those
Yeah,
types of positions.
Well, all of us, well, I would assume all of us, I know when I was in Vietnam, I had a top security clearance because I was in where a lot of these big decisions were being made. And all of that.
Was that pretty standard in headquarters company? Assuming?
I think at battalion level, I think it was. And I was shocked that they went back, FBI or whoever did those, went back to my hometown, to the high school, to my parents' friends, and the clearance was pretty tight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty thorough.
Yeah. So you got out in November of 1967. As far as 69.
69.
November of 1969, out of the military. What did you do upon your discharge from the military?
Well, at that point I was close to being 21, I think, and you'd given up 3 years of your life, and you're still. I don't think I was floundering, but I was searching for, well, what do I do from here?
Mm-hmm.
And so I went and did 2 years of college, and I still didn't know what I wanted to do, so I quit. Went to work for the railroad for 6 months, and that's when my life really started to change. I took off for Europe by myself, met my wife over there. 2 months later, we were married. The beginning of the next school year, I was back in and finishing college.
Mm-hmm. Was your wife French?
No, she was from Pittsburgh.
Just met in Paris.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So we traveled about 16 countries. We were there a long time. And,
Yeah. That was kind of an in thing back then. A lot of people were
it was
trains,
you know,
and hostels.
what a
and
great
travel.
time. You know, here I am, real young, and I'm seeing the world.
Yeah.
The world is at my fingertips, and you don't have to stay in fancy hotels
No.
to walk history.
They see the same thing you see.
Right, that's right, exactly.
So then you finished up, and I'm assuming just from our earlier conversation that you ended up with an education degree.
I did. I ended up teaching in Naperville, Illinois for 34 years.
Okay.
I was a gym teacher, and having left Vietnam, it has quite an impact on your life.
Mm-hmm.
So being a gym teacher, it was like going to therapy every day, the land of 1,000 smiles. And what's better, nothing better than having a little kid smile back at you or enjoy what you're doing, you know, what
Mm-hmm.
you're having them do. And it was a great career.
Uh-huh.
So,
Well, that's good. Is there anything that you'd like to say about your service before we conclude this? I've just got a couple more questions, but
I think it was a good thing for me. You look back at your life and where were you headed? I was an 18-year-old wise ass, and just like 90% of the other guys that we were with, well, that disappears real quick. I don't think it took about 3 days, and that part of my life was over.
Yeah.
And then you fall in line, and you learn to work, and the rewards come.
Yeah.
But you got to be willing to give up and get that discipline.
Yeah. Maturation process kicks
Right.
in pretty quickly.
Right. I feel bad that some type of mandatory service isn't still in effect, because I think our society has paid a great price, you know, for that not being there, because it was good for a lot of people and still is, but
Yeah.
unfortunately not enough have access to it.
Yeah. Doing some national service is probably a very good thing.
Right.
More respect for your country and all of this.
And
other stuff.
every individual.
And you learn a lot from that process.
Correct. You learn about people and discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Self-discipline is a huge thing in life.
Yeah. How have you seen the country change as far as a Vietnam veteran from the first years you were out of the service to the last 10 or 15 years? Have you noticed changes?
Yeah, I think people are idealistic, and they are quick to forget the past. You know, some of us that are, I'm 71, you look back and the good old days were great, and there were never any problems. Well, there were lots of problems all over the world. There was Khrushchev, Castro, Baptista, the names, there was the Congo and all these other places where problems occurred. But once they're in the past, they kind of stay in the past. And you think that now the world's going to hell in a handbasket? I don't think so.
Yeah.
You know, it'll right itself, and hopefully these will be the good old days for the
next
people that
generation.
are young, right,
Yeah.
that are now.
Well, okay, well, that's all I have. If you have anything else that you hadn't thought of,
No, I just want to say thank you for your time and efforts. It's very nice of you to do this.
and thank you for your service. Thank you very much.
Thank you.